The patient monitor suddenly throws up a jagged, unfamiliar line, and an alarm starts blaring. You have seconds to act. In that moment, you face an immediate choice. You need to know whether your patient's physiology is actively failing or if the life support machinery itself is malfunctioning. This flowchart breaks down the capnography dilemma. When you see an abnormal waveform, your response branches down one of two paths: fixing the patient's pathophysiology or troubleshooting a hardware malfunction. To navigate this, we have to look past capnometry, which is just the isolated number of carbon dioxide the patient exhales, and focus on capnography, the continuous waveform plotted out over time. Relying only on a normal ETCO₂ number between 35 and 45 millimeters of mercury can create a false sense of security. Long before that number drops, the physical shape of the wave shifts, telegraphing an impending crisis. This graph shows exactly what a normal capnogram should look like. It forms a distinct boxy hill divided into 4 specific phases. Phase I is the initial flat line at the beginning. This represents dead space air, gas that has been inhaled but hasn't reached the lungs to participate in gas exchange yet, meaning the CO2 level is at 0. Phase II is the sudden upward slope. Here, that dead space gas begins to mix with the CO2-rich air being pushed out of the lungs as the patient actively exhales. Next is Phase III, the alveolar plateau. This flat top represents the bulk of the exhalation, culminating at the very peak with the maximum ETCO₂ value. Finally, Phase 0 is the steep downward drop. The patient takes a new breath in, and fresh gas rapidly washes the CO2 concentration back down to 0. By memorizing this precise boxy structure, you establish a baseline. Any deviation from this exact shape dictates whether you reach for emergency medications or start disassembling the ventilator. Let's look at what happens when the machinery is working perfectly, but the patient's internal respiratory mechanics are failing. This comparison matrix correlates the visual waveform pattern with its clinical translation and exact action required. First is the airway obstruction profile. The wave completely loses its flat top and curves upward, taking on the distinct shape of a shark's dorsal fin. Clinically, this means alveolar gas takes too long to empty, causing severe air trapping. Because this isolates the issue to the patient's pathophysiology, specifically asthma or COPD, you skip equipment checks. The immediate intervention is administering bronchodilators. This same diagnostic logic applies in the operating room, where anesthesiologists use the wave to track the exact metabolic state of a paralyzed patient. Next is the pharmacological shift profile. Notice the sudden Carrera cleft dipping right in the middle of the Phase III plateau. This cleft indicates the patient's diaphragm is making an independent, spontaneous effort to pull in air against the ventilator. When you see this dip, it confirms the surgical muscle relaxants are actively wearing off. You now have a clear choice: either push more paralytics to maintain the block, or begin preparing the patient for extubation. Notice the pattern. When structural alterations occur along the wave's top plateau, the problem is locked inside the patient's physiology, requiring a pharmacological solution. Now consider the opposite scenario. The patient's lungs are perfectly healthy, but the life support machinery attached to them is failing. We map hardware malfunctions using the same matrix, but examining entirely different parts of the breath cycle. First, the equipment failure profile. Notice how the trough of the wave never returns to the baseline before the next breath begins. Clinically, a baseline resting above 0 means the patient continuously rebreathes their own expelled carbon dioxide. Ruling out lung pathology entirely, the culprit is an exhausted soda lime canister or incompetent expiratory valve. To prevent toxicity, replace the equipment immediately. The other key area for mechanical failure happens exactly when the patient takes a breath in. Look at the valve malfunction profile. Instead of a sharp, clean drop during the inspiratory downstroke, a sudden bump of CO2 registers. This shows fresh gas is being actively contaminated with exhaled carbon dioxide as it enters the circuit. You can definitively pinpoint a malfunctioning inspiratory valve. Medications won't help here. This requires immediate mechanical troubleshooting. If the baseline fails to reach 0, or if anomalies interrupt the inspiratory downstroke, you stop evaluating the patient's physiology and immediately fix the machinery. The physical shape of the waveform diagnoses the exact type of problem you are facing. But to understand the patient's immediate metabolic and circulatory state, we have to look at the absolute ETCO₂ numbers. This scorecard maps specific numerical fluctuations and assigns exact clinical responses across EMS, the operating room, and the ICU. The red arrow indicating increased ETCO₂ spikes above normal during hypoventilation, a sudden fever, or a return of spontaneous circulation after CPR. Respond to this increase based on context. Either increase the patient's ventilation rate to clear the CO2, or if you're running a code, recognize that chest compressions just restarted the heart. Conversely, the blue arrow shows decreased ETCO₂. A sharp drop points to hyperventilation, a pulmonary embolism, or sudden cardiac arrest. When the number drops, lower the ventilation rate, or immediately initiate severe circulatory support to restore blood flow to the lungs. While these numerical trends guide your treatment, the very existence of the wave is your most fundamental tool for confirming safety. Seeing 5 to 6 persistent, rhythmic waveforms is the definitive way to verify a breathing tube is seated in the trachea, not the esophagus. Once that wave is established, any sudden, complete loss of the waveform indicates a physical emergency. Check immediately for tube dislodgement or cardiac arrest, rather than waiting for other clinical signs. In advanced care, diagnostic depth increases by monitoring the natural gap between the CO2 in the blood and the exhaled CO2. Under normal conditions, this gradient stays tight, typically between 2 and 5 millimeters of mercury. If this numerical gap widens, it reveals a physiological mismatch where air is reaching the lungs but blood is not. This finding should prompt an immediate scan for a pulmonary embolism or a severe COPD exacerbation. The monitor gives a wealth of data, but it's up to you to interpret it correctly. Don't just treat the number on the screen. Let the morphology of every single breath dictate your exact clinical intervention.